Good morning, everyone. George, you're laughing. Are you laughing at my surroundings, or what are you laughing about?
No, just that it went 3, 2, 1, go. I hadn't seen it work that way, so it was cool.
Yeah, well, someday I'll get a studio staff, and we'll have a big, elaborate introduction. Um, we went ahead and started right at 9, and some people will filter in as time goes on.
Just a second here. I
No
got
worries.
my phone. Okay.
Now I'll tell people we're going to continue to talk about fire fuel today. I'm in fire fuel at the moment. I'll get into the details of that in a little bit. But while people are filtering in, go ahead and tell us where you are. You're down in Southern California.
Yeah,
Last time
in
you
the
went from Oregon to.
in Borrego Springs, which is surrounded by Anza Borrego State Park, which is one of the largest state parks. I think it is the largest state park in California. It's like 650,000 acres, and it's a representative of the Colorado desert ecosystem, which is a little unique. There's a small section of Colorado desert that comes into California, mostly found down in Baja. Some species that you would only find in this part of California and no place else in the rest of the United States. And it's Borrego Springs is a town of about 3,000 people. It's not very busy here right now and pretty quiet. And so I'm visiting some friends from Montana who wanted to get out of the cold. And so that's why they're here.
Yeah, they could get really out of the cold with the fires down there in
Well,
SoCal.
this is on the other side of the mountains from where all the fires are happening. So at least here on this side, well, at least at the lower elevations, it's really sparse desert. But you can see the effect of the drought that's been happening in the region, in that there's almost nothing green. Like the plants that are native to this area. A lot of them are kind of shriveled up. There's not many blooming flowers. There's you can tell that unless they're right close to water or something, they don't have any water for them to sustain themselves. Which I also think about what's happening. What are the birds and so forth doing to eat around here? Because there's not much growing.
Mm-hmm. And that's in a state park that you told me is otherwise pretty good health
Yeah,
due to no grazing,
yeah,
at least
yeah.
partial.
It hasn't as great. This park, I think, was established like in the 1930s. Just a second. In the 1930s, I keep getting spam calls. It was established in the 1930s, and it had been grazed prior to that. As they always do in all these places, they have the history of Rancher Bob or whatever named this canyon or ran his
Right,
cattle here, so forth.
right.
But in general, it's in pretty good shape. Most of it is state wilderness, which means that you can't even have motorized vehicles. But they do have one section or several sections of the park that are dedicated to ORVs. But overall, it's in very good shape.
It's interesting uh, that when I'm going out and observing, which is why I'm out here right now, is out documenting the goat damage. How sometimes I have to debate. I'm like, okay, is this damage from the livestock, or is this damage from the illegal uh, off-road vehicles that no one does
Mhm.
anything about either?
Mhm.
But I'm going to be very specific about the observations I made this week, and I want to get your input and just see what you think about it, whether these are valid points or concerns, and if you have any examples from your past to elaborate on this.
Okay.
Um, Now, because these observations that I've been making are redundant, like it's pretty much the same thing everywhere I hike to, I'm limiting today to 1 square mile of observations. Now, in that square mile, I found 15 decimated coyote brush plants. This is I'm in goat grazing
Mhm.
area. Okay, now some people listening might say, well, 15 isn't a very big number. What are you being so dramatic about? Until you consider that that's 100% of the coyote brush in that area.
Hmm.
So it is indeed a small number, but when you consider that, I mean, that's part of the problem. There are only 15 for the wildlife to work with in the first place, and now they're decimated. They were, coyote brushes, perennially green, provides great cover. I see a lot of animals like to make burrows at the base of it, in addition to the birds hiding and
Yep.
even nesting inside. But all of it was sacrificed for this goat grazing program because, people dismissively say, well, you know, we can't have those fires. So here's part two. In that same square mile where 15 coyote brush plants were decimated, I found 6 wooden benches finished with a chemical uh, cover, uh, 2 wooden tree swings, 2 rubber tire swings, 3 illegal debris dumps of 2x4s and branches and things like that. Um, and then at the outer edge of all of that square mile area, I'm going back into the urban section where everyone has their fences up to protect them from the horrible, horrible wildlife that they've developed next to. And all those wooden fences have either dead, denuded, or green plants touching them. And then you have plants deeper into those yards, and you have plants up against the houses. I even saw rubber tires in some of these yards. I even saw a coyote brush in a couple of the yards.
Hmm.
So I'm trying to get to the absurdity of justifying destroying the only 15 native plants that remain on this hillside because people are that scared of fire fuel when they have brought more fire fuel out here in pure biomass than the biomass that was removed by the goats on those coyote brush plants. And I didn't even mention the kid forts. They got these gigantic kid forts that are basically bonfires waiting to happen. And I know I sound like a grouchy old man, but my point isn't to complain about kid forts or tire swings. My point is to call out the hypocrisy of humans who rush to say, well, it's fine if we do it, but we can't have naturally occurring native plants even when there's only 15 of them left.
Mhm.
Is that enough to get you to react?
Well, I think the main point you're trying to say is that the construction of the urban area provides more fuel, which is absolutely correct, and fuel that will burn hotter than anything that's found in the natural world. And that is one of the changes that if places in California or any place in the West actually is going to be less likely to burn up, we have to change partly where we build, of course, and second, what we build with, so that the structures are less flammable in the first place. And like you were mentioning, the fences there, that I've seen that over and over again, where a fence attaches to a house, and it the fire catches on the fence, and then the fence burns to the house and provides that ignition for that ultimately burns down the whole house. So,
Well, that's part of the point, and I'm glad I'm having a conversation because I might have failed to make this point clear. The other part of the point is that not only do the urban spots, the officially urban spots, have the fire fuel, humans are actively hauling fire fuel out into the natural areas.
oh, I
These
see. Yeah,
benches, these benches are set up on the hillside for human convenience and enjoyment. But is it if you're going to complain about a green native plant being fire fuel, how can you haul wood out into that same area and leave it?
sure. Yeah.
I'm also laying on. I don't. A lot of people have wondered. See, the goats have just come through here, and they're behind me. They'd be a better backdrop, except it's really windy on the other side of this hill. If my girlfriend ever saw this, she'd freak out, but I'm on top of goat shit. And the reason I'm on top of goat shit is there is absolutely nowhere I could possibly sit down and not be on goat shit. So I was thinking about how if this burned, some of it would turn to ash, some of it would go into the air. But when it's being grazed upon, it's getting trampled, it's getting partially chewed and left behind, and it's being converted into fecal matter, which in my mind, you have to consider that an awfully large percent of that fuel is still there at the end of the day.
Yeah, yeah, it's pushed down a little bit, but yes, it will burn hotter then at that point. The main thing that there's two other things to consider when you've made this point before, Skylar, and you know this well, is that these plants come back very quickly and often more robustly than they were before. Partly, you're talking about the fertilization and when you eliminate the competition, then when the plants do grow back, they grow back at usually a lot of studies show higher biomass than before there was any treatment, and so
Hmm.
it it's a very short term kind of solution to what they're trying to accomplish, and people don't realize that any kind of fuel reduction that is done often requires to be repeated over and over and over again forever. And so that is a part of the equation that's almost never addressed because often it's just a one-time move through and then forgotten, and then the grasses or shrubs or whatever's there grows back, but grows back in greater abundance.
Yes, I see that in every location that I've observed, except where there isn't grazing.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, the human psyche, people getting upset when I say something like that because they don't want to believe it, is really interesting. But maybe you could elaborate on the fertilization because some people questioned whether or not goat poop, the nitrogen in the goat poop benefiting nitrogen loving plants is a significant amount. Originally, when I first heard about nitrogen benefiting nitrogen loving invasive weeds, I was indeed talking about cattle poop,
Right,
the dairy cattle out in Point Reyes, which
right.
is clear, those are big dumps by
Yes.
comparison. Plus the ranchers intentionally spread it out over that land. So, but I went and started filming the goat poop on this hill, and I think people would be a little bit shocked at how much there is. So, do you think when you say fertilization, are you talking about goat poop, or are you simply talking about trampling vegetation and seeds right back into the soil?
I'm talking about the poop because it has been shown. I don't know about goat poop, but as you explained, at least with cattle, there have been studies that show that nitrification often favors like cheatgrass, which is a highly flammable grass, is favored by nitrogen enrichment, and so it changes the composition of the resulting regrowth as a result of that. And then, of course, all that stuff goes into streams and eutrophication of streams
Yep.
and enrichment of streams that changes the ecology of aquatic ecosystems is another
Yep.
consequence of all that. Here's something to think about. I'm not going to be talking about the goat poop, but I can talk about cattle poop. The average
Okay.
cow poops out as much a dairy cow as much as 100 pounds of fecal matter a day. To give you and to give a comparison, the average human is about 1 pound. So every cow out there is putting out the poop of 100 people, and yet so if you had 1,000 cows grazing out there, that would be like dumping the poop from a city of
Yeah.
100,000 people. Who would tolerate having 100,000, the poop
Yeah.
of 100,000 people just spread over the land? I mean, we think it was absurd.
The for Biological Diversity actually put out something many years ago showing that there is more fecal matter in Point Reyes, a national park, than I think they said San Francisco or one of the major cities was producing.
Yeah. Well, the single most, if I remember correctly, again, you want to check on this, but as I recall, the single most polluted stream on the whole California coast comes out of Point Reyes,
Yes,
which is,
correct.
it's a national seashore. You would think that would be some of the cleanest water on the California coast. Instead, it's some of the most polluted, mostly from the grazing by the dairy cows and the beef cattle there. So,
So let's segue from uh, novices, just average citizens blindly defending grazing because it makes them feel like something's being done to protect them, to the professionals
okay.
who also back this up. Have you encountered anyone that demonstrated that they truly understood what the magic amount of tolerable fire fuel is out here? Like I'm picturing how they just, oh, we're going to chop down this tree, or we're going to chop down these branches, or we're going to kill these plants and leave these plants. And it all just seems like you have no idea what you're doing, but no one is calling you out because people are just happy to see that something is taking place.
Um, the best that I can recall, just off the top of my head, is that usually just a comparison of what was there before they treated the site to what they had when it was done treating the site. And the assumption is if there's less biomass after they treat it, that will reduce the spread of fires. And it's a little more complicated than that because a lot of times it has to do with, is it the same vegetation? Just because it's biomass doesn't mean it's the same kind of vegetation. As I mentioned, like cheatgrass may grow in abundance, which is much more flammable than, say, native grasses. It could also be the way that the fuel on the ground is arranged would be changed. So just because there might be less biomass doesn't mean that it will be less flammable. And especially when we're talking about forested areas, thinning the forest can often lead to more fires, even though there's less biomass, because the forest now will dry out quicker with less trees shading the soil, and the
Yes.
wind can penetrate more easily. And wind, as we've talked about in the past, is probably the single greatest factor that spreads fire through transferring embers into the air that go miles ahead of the fire front. So, just looking at, we removed X number of pounds of fuel here per acre or whatever, doesn't really capture what may be going on there in terms of how a fire might be affected.
I'm just moving slightly. If people can see what's next to me, are the still remaining stalks of invasive thistles, and underneath of me is this that the goats leave behind. Now, between the fire fuel that's still standing and this stuff on the ground, what you just said about embers just makes it seem to me like there's no way this isn't enough for it to continue to move across this hillside and then get to all the fire fuel that the humans have drug out here to keep the fire going.
Well, that's exactly, in fact, something like in about half of the structures that burn down um, are often because of what's called a surface fire of going through the grass. In other words, it's not a wall of flames; it's a flame that's a foot high or something that burns through all that material you've got there. You just had in your hand and burns to, say, like a fence or to somebody's wooden deck, and then starts the house on to burn down. So that kind of one of the things that have been talked about in terms of reducing the spread of fires to houses is to have like a 4 or 5 foot band of, say, gravel around the foundation, because of that very fact that the fires, they don't this whole idea in people's minds that the forest fires and big trees and a wall of flames, that's not how most structures burn down. They burn down because of a small flame a foot high burning through the grass and shrubs right up to their house, or embers getting blown onto something on the house that like leaves and needles in the gutters, which catch on fire and then lead to the house burning down.
So you would, I was about to comment that in between these dead zones, that's what landscaping looks like to me now. You have the decorative plant that the humans have chosen to be there, and then in between that, absolutely nothing is allowed because that vegetation on the ground is seen as what's going to cause the fire, not the standing vegetation right next to the house.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I don't know. That seems a little bit ludicrous to me, especially when I go down into the creek where the goats haven't grazed and we have natural leaf fall ground cover and it's moist and the soil underneath those leaves is moist and the leaves themselves are moist.
Right,
If there was going to be a fire on this hillside, I would head straight to that cropping of trees down there where it's shaded
right,
and moist.
right.
And
No,
yet
that's
we see those trees as the enemy, George. It's just blows my mind.
well, you've hit on something that's also true. Like in undisturbed forests, there's often a lot of logs on the ground that soak up moisture over time, and they actually act as
Mhm.
little fire breaks in stopping the spread of burning on the forest floor. Unless it's extreme drought, a lot of those logs you can put your hand into a pulpy log and take it up and squeeze water out of it. I've done it many
Yep.
times. So, and that's the kind of when they get done thinning forests and so forth, it's like they've sanitized the forest and they've gotten rid of all those snags and woody debris on the ground and prevent new woody debris from being there. When a lot of those, plus the shading from the existing forest, tends to keep it cooler and moister.
Everyone will have to forgive me if I fall down because the goats have also caused incredible erosion on this hillside. Um, if anyone just if you can see behind me, there is not one native species here, whether it's still standing or partially grazed upon. And this situation gets worse every single year. And that makes it extra frustrating that there's a handful of coyote brush that fights its way back from the brink of death from the damage the goats do every year, just in time for the birds to say, oh, look, I have some shelter for the cold winter coming. And then no, destroyed. We keep sacrificing the good things here for the idea that we're solving this, and we never solve it. In fact, we're making it worse. And we're paying taxpayer dollars for it. I leave you speechless.
Well,
And
no, I
it
mean,
wasn't
you're
a very
just
good
saying the
setup.
stuff that's true. I mean, the only response I'd have is you're on target. Yeah. So
I
that's
guess,
that's the irony is in a lot of cases we're paying for quote solutions that aren't a solution in the end, and we wind up paying for that to be implemented. And people have to realize that there's that when you have somebody like advocating grazing to reduce fires or logging to reduce fires, there is a vested interest in the people that are advocating that because
of
if
course,
you're a timber company or you're a rancher or whatever, you have a financial reward for those kinds of activities. So it's not that, and I always hesitate to condemn everything because a lot of times there's some sort of parcel of truth in some of these things, but you still have to take it and say what is the financial benefit to who's ever making advocating this stuff. I mean, for example, I would use the opposite. You don't have a financial benefit from criticizing this stuff. But if a rancher is saying let's graze the land because we're going to reduce fires, uh, he's not doing that entirely out of the goodness of his heart, and because there's a financial reward. So you have to, I always say, follow the money and see, what are the finances behind that, and then of course those individuals, the timber companies, the livestock industry, and so forth, have a lot of influence with politicians. And most politicians, they don't know anything about fire stuff, but they advocate that federal monies or state monies or county monies should be used to reduce fires. They want to see something done that they see as proactive. And a lot of times, I guess that's a certain thing about humans in general. It's like our first inclination is always to do something, anything,
Yeah. Yep.
uh, even if it's not necessarily proven to be effective. And in a lot of cases, we need to think through these things much more and understand uh, that there are a lot of financial reasons why certain things are pushed. And the other thing that's important is scale. A lot of these quote solutions um, our studies will show that they work on some sort of small scale, but they don't work necessarily on a landscape level. And that's a very important thing because what you're trying to do is, I mean, if you can just do it in a small scale, in most cases, that's going to make no difference in the end. And so, uh, uh, to the degree that something might be effective, is you have to ask, is this effective at a larger scale? I'll give you an example. One of the things that they're doing in the sagebrush country through, Nevada and southern Idaho and so forth is making, quote, fuel breaks. And the fuel breaks are being made by bulldozing through sagebrush to basically make like a
Ah,
road. And they can show that if you have a very low fire weather conditions, in other words, where fires are barely going to keep burning even if you do nothing, and it reaches the road, it will go out. But that doesn't matter at the extreme levels where the large fires happen when you have winds blowing 50 miles an hour. They'll just blow embers right across that fuel break. So we're putting all these, quote, fuel breaks out there. And then the other thing about the fuel breaks is that they tend to be the best place for colonization by flammable
yes.
aliens like cheatgrass. So you're
Yes.
creating more fuel that is the kind that's likely to burn on your, quote, fuel breaks, and they're not effective at any kind of landscape scale. So
Yeah, I don't leave a lot of room for forgiveness when we declare ourselves the most intelligent species and, as you said, just rush into doing something, anything. At this point, we should be able to strategize better. And if we aren't strategizing better or being more intelligent, then you have to wonder, wait a minute, maybe there's a financial incentive for certain people for us not to be acting more intelligent. And
yeah,
as you pointed out, I don't have a financial incentive.
right.
Uh, I'm just upset because all the areas that I go through and I appreciate the wildlife, I see humans making the odds of surviving next to impossible by what we keep doing to it. So then we have this back and forth where people will be like, oh, well, you're just a ridiculous hippie. The most important thing here is protecting humans. But those people, if ever confronted with me saying, well, okay, so you don't care what's happening to the wildlife here, will turn around and try to pretend that they do. But the bottom line is all we do is destroy without a follow up. Where's part two? Why don't I ever see a part two? In fact, I've never seen an ecologist or a botanist or a biologist ever come out here and observe the effects of the goat grazing. It just happens. It just takes place every single year, and not a single one of these plans has a deadline. Not a single one of them says when you can expect to see an improvement, and nobody has a problem with that. And if I were a manipulative person who just wanted to make a dollar, what a great industry to go into. No expenses. The goats reproduce freely, so you have a never ending supply. You can sell off their flesh if you want a little extra money. Not only is the food provided to you for free, but you also get paid for your animals to eat. I mean, there's very little in the way of negatives in
Well,
this
there's one
industry.
other thing too, because you're grazing. I don't know. I presume this is public land that you're talking about here. Uh,
Yes,
if
I'm
it
in. Yeah,
if it is, that's land they don't have to pay any taxes on either. So that's an added benefit compared to if they had to be grazing entirely on private lands then that they own, they'd have to pay that uh, the taxes and other upkeep, uh, you know, fences, etc., that are provided on the public lands at little or no cost.
let me read from a viewer who commented, people have a really hard time understanding the connectivity that invasive plants give to fire. And George touched on it, and I see it everywhere that something native is removed. Well, something's going to fill in that space, and it's always an invasive. I mean, that's what makes them invasive. This person also says the ranchers create the negative feedback loop. Graze to fix. The grazing spreads the problem. Need to graze more land to fix. Problem spreads. Yes, that's absolutely correct. Spot on.
Yeah, that is, and how that happens, just for the people listening, uh, most invasives, their whole life strategy is to colonize areas that are disturbed lands. That's what they go into places that have a lot of disturbance, so soil disturbance or less competition from other plants or whatever, and they're designed to take advantage of that disturbance, which when there's no grazing and no disturbance, a lot of native plants are designed to live in a place that isn't disturbed and compete in that kind of
Yeah.
environment. And they make it
Yeah.
more difficult for an invasive species to establish in those kind of places because they're designed to live in a place without that kind of disturbance. And so, and we're disturbing the land in so many ways. It's grazing, it's ORV use, it's building roads for logging. It just all these kinds of disturbances favor the invasive species, and that's why they keep expanding. And the native species, the native species can usually compete against the invasives if the invasives are not given an advantage by having the disturbance to the land and the soils, the extra nitrogen they might be getting to grow faster, and the kinds of situation, and even the grazing, which tends to be selective for the native species more than the invasives in a lot of cases. So the invasives are getting ignored in a lot of cases by the grazing animals, whereas the native species are the ones that are getting chomped on and consumed. And of course, so that means that they're not producing seeds. They're having to expend energy to restore their leaf material so they can keep on photosynthesizing and so forth. So they're put at a competitive disadvantage by grazing activity.
I was just thinking about, we're in a dry spell even during our rainy season, and these plants were probably storing some moisture in the leaves that the goats ate. These plants have nothing left to try and fight the drought now. They're not going to get any water to go to their roots, and they no longer have leaves to photosynthesize or store moisture. It's, the list of things that we do to native habitat that are just plain mean, in my opinion, is really, really long.
Let me touch on another thing that you just mentioned. Water to the roots of the plants. Another consequence of grazing is soil compaction. And there's dozens of studies that show that the soil compaction reduces the infiltration of water. And what happens is that water runs off and you get more erosion than on the landscape that takes the topsoil away, clogs up streams with sediment affecting fish and aquatic life and so forth. So that's another consequence of the livestock grazing. And some people say, well, there were always buffalo or elk, or for one thing, there were not buffalo in California, but in any kind of historic context, back 100 million years ago, a million years ago, maybe they were there, but they weren't there during any recent time. And wildlife moves around a lot more. It's not concentrated usually in large concentrated herds like the domestic animals are forced to do. So anyway, it's a false equivalency, and people have to recognize that native animals use the landscape differently than domestic animals. Most native animals are much more mobile. For example, I had a friend that I'll just use a comparison with bison and livestock. A friend of mine was studying bison, and he was trying to see what kind of habitat they use and so forth. And so when the bison at night, he would bed down in his sleeping bag, just wherever happened to be close to the bison. He'd wake up in the morning and there'd be no bison around. But he had radio collars on. He'd find they were 5 or 10 miles away, and there's still plenty of food there. They just moved. That was sort of that whole, way of living. They just move randomly across the landscape. Whereas cattle, they don't move unless they're forced to move. So
That's what
there's just a difference in the way the animals use the landscape under normal situation, native animals versus domestic.
Julie Phillips, the Tule elk biologist, described the same thing. When she would try to track the elk across California, she would bed down, and the next day she'd be alone.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
exactly.
Now, let
Yep.
me apologize to everyone. This may end abruptly. I'm drawing a lot of battery power out here. But so far, it's been a pretty great discussion. I want to talk about the compaction and water running down in some of these areas that they graze, and the goats pass over the same spot trying to get to the next location. It's
Yeah.
just been trampled. It's just been trampled into no life whatsoever. And I look at it and I say, well, this is just starting to look like a street or pavement. And if you look at streets, what happens when it rains? Everything just rushes to the gutters and then rushes down into whatever the runoff destination is. The land isn't receiving the water.
Right.
And even on the hillside where rain should be absorbed naturally, it's not even happening there because of the soil compaction and
Right.
the lack of a healthy root system or any ground cover that might slow down that water flow.
Well, the compaction affects the infiltration. The other thing, too, by the way, Skylar, is when you remove a lot of that vegetation, it allows the soil to be exposed to the air, and it dries out the solar radiation, and the wind will dry the soil more. So you have the two effects. One, you're getting less water to soak in the first place, and then due to the exposure, because you don't have the plant cover there anymore, the soil, the air sucks the moisture out of the soil, making it even more arid and dry. So you're doing two things that increase what the term is desertification of the landscape.
Absolutely. We just keep hitting it from every angle. And sometimes I get so depressed, I think, man, I almost wish the wildlife just disappeared, because when I do spot one trying to survive out here, I'm like, man, you're up against impossible odds. But good for you for trying. But every year we make it that much harder. You mentioned the birds at the beginning.
Yeah.
I don't know how anyone can be surprised that the amount of native life is reduced every single year here when there's no way. I mean, how exactly do people think the animals that need habitat survive without habitat?
Yeah. No, I call it the sanitation. I'm mostly referring it to thinning the forest, but it's the same effect. When they go in there and thin the forest, they're taking out a lot of the trees that would otherwise provide habitat for all different species, including after they die, as logs on the ground, as snags for tree nesting animals and birds and so forth. And and yet all that kind of habitat is eliminated by a thinning project, and I call it a sanitation of the ecosystem. And these, if done across a large amount of the territory, makes a big effect on the wildlife habitat available. So,
George, I think we had a great show, and I'm gonna end us smoothly before the battery runs out.
sure.
People might be able to see the goats back there, but the wind is too strong for me to broadcast from there. But George, it was a pleasure. I hope people are benefiting from this. I'm sure some of you are, and thanks to those of you who tuned in. And George, enjoy the rest of your time in SoCal.
Okay. Thanks for having me on, Skylar. We'll see you.
My pleasure.
Okay. Bye.